Hello. Mine? Oh, hello, hello. There are some things you guys should know about this. They have a TV up front where you can see yourself. And if you know anything about human nature, I'm going to spend the rest of this conversation with myself right down here on this little screen, so forgive me. That's a really large room full of people. I get excited when 6 people shows up. You're like multiples of 6. Welcome. It's good to have you. So out of random curiosity, how many people came here because they were looking to figure out more methods of death than dismemberment? That's at the end. Just hang out. You have to pay for the whole time in order to get the treat. How many people are here because they have been part of a dysfunctional team? How many people are here because they are the dysfunctional part of their team? You're just learning for technique. I know you people. All right, so that's me. My name is Kimberly McGill. I'm a managing consultant with Engaged Partners, which is a really small consulting company out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I've done a whole lot of stuff for a really long time, even though I've been 29 for multiple years now. And I am a believer in the little stuff, and what that really means is I believe that the most powerful thing any organization can do is invest in its people, and invest in treating its people as if they're actual people, which is weird, I'll grant you, but it kind of works out. So we did this part just because I wanted to, so we won't stick much here. He's cute, huh? Yeah. So I think it's kind of important to let you know is we're going to talk about some science today, right? We're going to talk about some behavioral science today. And it's going to be kind of cool and it's going to kind of be interesting. There's a couple of things you should know. If you've ever taken any psychology classes, anthropology classes, sociology classes, I am going to do a disservice to all of those topics today. Because I am not really going to go deep into any one particular thing. I'm going to give you some cursory information so that we can have a good conversation around behavior. The other thing you should probably know is I already knew the frameworks I'm going to give you are really, really general. I wrote them. But it's intended for a reason, right? Because implementing this is an art. There is no one way to interact with people. So I'm going to give you some frameworks of things that I think are really useful that I've been able to use in the past. And you can take them out and use them, but understand the minute you start talking to another human being, you probably aren't going to be able to use bullet 1, bullet 2, or bullet 3 in any of the following slides. You're actually going to have to understand the intent that you're trying to do by the framework and just work with that person to reach the intent. So for all of you people who are very, very literal, it's not intended to be very, very literal. It's an art. So what is dysfunction? And I think it's really important we start this conversation out with a common definition because I think we say lots and lots of things are dysfunctional, and they're not. So tell me what you guys think when I say dysfunctional. Give me a couple of examples or your definition of dysfunction. What is a dysfunction? So this is the part that's going to be really hard because I really want to move into my slide deck. And so now people outside of this room think I am in my own PowerPoint slide, which is cool, but I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to stay here. So now I'm back here. So give me an example of dysfunction. When I say dysfunction, what do you think? Fighting, distrust. Anything else? Lame, I think is a fairly good definition. Don't talk to each other, so failures in communication. Oxford says it's a disruption of normal social relations. And my brothers, Merriam-Webster, they think it's abnormal or unhealthy interpersonal behavior or interaction within a group. These people get paid by the word, by the way. So what this really breaks down to is you have an agreed upon social contract in any group of people you're in. And if you are acting in a way that's adversely impacting that social contract, you've introduced dysfunction into that environment. You should also understand that those contracts change as the group changes, right? So your little nuclear team will have an agreed upon contract about how they want to behave, what is functional for them. Your larger department will have an agreed upon contract about how you're supposed to behave, what is functional for them. Your organization will have a contract about what you need to do, what's functional for them. The culture in which your company exists will have a contract about what's expected, what's normal, and how you interact in that. So we're only going to really be talking about that very nuclear team, but I think it's important to understand that all of these things influence each other, right? So while behind closed doors, my team and I can cuss as if it was a competition, probably should not do that in a board meeting. There's just a different social contract that goes on there, right? There's a different set of expectations that happen. I think we should also talk about the fact that dysfunction exists in a scale. This actually is from a book called Secrets of Facilitation by Michael Wilkson. The book, by the way, not worth buying. This chart, however, absolutely worth the money I paid for it. And I think it's really interesting to look at the scale of what's considered a dysfunction, right? And this is measured by disruption. How disruptive is the behavior that is being engaged in? And it starts at the bottom with showing up late, showing up late and leaving early. And it goes all the way up to physically attacking someone. And that seems like a great segue for why the hell did I get into this? So when I was 26 or 27, I had gotten a reputation for being really good at dealing with, and I'm going to air quote, dysfunctional teams. What I really was good at is helping people who didn't communicate very well with each other communicate better with each other. And through an acquaintance, I got an opportunity to go in a company, and I interviewed, and they said, hey, we have this team. They need a little bit of help. We've heard that this is something you do really well. We would like you to help us. And because at that time I actually believed my own hype, I didn't ask enough questions. I'm like, hell yeah, bring them on. I got this, no problem. I've done this in the past. I can do this in the future. So I arrive, and I walk in and walk down the aisle where this team is sitting. No one looks up. No one makes eye contact. No one says hi. Nobody says anything. And I think, my God, this is the most introverted group of people I have ever met in my life. They are truly terrified to communicate with anybody but their computer. So my normal method for dealing with any kind of new situation is just to sit back and watch, right? See how people interact with each other, see the kind of environment you're getting into. So the next day, we go into a planning meeting. How many of you have been in a planning meeting? How many of those have ended in, like, the police being called? Yeah. So we go into this planning meeting, and during the course of the day I was there, I found out that this is actually the convergence of two teams, one who had owned a legacy system and one who had been brought in to update the technology that system existed in. And they had been mushed together in a single unit because that is an amazing thing to do. And so they had taken the guy who was the original architect of the legacy system and made him the lead, and they had brought in an architect for the new technology. And to say these people didn't like each other would sort of be like saying Berlin had a small hill separating them. It just was unbelievable. We hadn't even shut the door of the planning meeting before they were on each other. They were just ripping into each other about solutioning and not understanding and being jerks. And they're getting louder and louder and louder, and I'm kind of sitting at the table trying to figure out what's going on. And I look back, and the team staring at their table in front of them. And all of a sudden, the architect reaches over and grabs the lapel of the guy in front of him and jerks him up across the table. And the team lead reaches around and grabs the front of his shirt and jerks him up. And they're in each other's face, and they're screaming, and this team is going. So what does that tell you? Not the first time something like this has happened. So needless to say, the cop calling pandemonium a panic thing was probably my fault, since I didn't think that this was okay. So I went home that night and I cried a lot, because that wasn't like dysfunction the way I had ever seen it. That was the most abnormal, bizarre, chaotic clusterfuck, thing I had ever seen in my entire life. And it really got me thinking, how in the name of good money did we go from the bottom of this scale to the top of this scale and nobody did anything? Nobody stopped this. Nobody stepped in and said, this is not okay. We can't behave this way. And apparently it happened more than once, because that team didn't jump up and go, oh my gosh, they're being violent. They're like, oh no, not again. So it really got me thinking that I didn't understand people at all, and I certainly didn't understand organizations at all. And I will tell you, I still don't understand people or organizations. I just have a lot more information to play with. So we're back to our fundamental question. How does a team devolve into that kind of dysfunction? To be fair, we're really going to talk more about the middle part. These are the guys that are disengaged, folding their arms, not interested, They haven't really kind of gotten to the abusive language part, but they're starting to border in there, right? So this is kind of that normal level of when we actually start noticing, maybe we ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto. This team seems to have gone way into Oz. So we're going to kind of stay in that realm, because extreme dysfunction is a different conversation. And I think we should probably start with, what does a not so dysfunctional team look like? So how many people have seen this? This is from 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Patrick Lencioni, no? Anyway, this book might actually be worth buying if you can find it used. It's pretty neat. But the reason I want to bring this up is because at the base of this is trust. There is no such thing as a team that functions without trust. Now, when you bring together new people, it's really difficult to say, I trust you as a person, because honestly, I don't know jack about you as a person. What I have to be able to do is trust that we have the same intent. We have the same goal. We have the same outcome in mind. We're all driving towards the same ultimate place. And if we can establish that trust pretty early in a new team, and there's techniques for doing that, but if we can establish that trust pretty early in a new team, that even though I don't know you, I can trust that we're all trying to do the right thing, it makes it easier to get to the next level, which is constructive disagreement. This is where we're able to actually have conversations about what's really right, as opposed to we're just going to do what we're told, right? Because we do what we're told when we don't trust. We actually have opinions about things when we trust that we're going to be listened to and that people are going to at least be willing to talk to us about our thoughts. And so once teams get to the place where they really feel as if they can contribute, as if they have a voice in something, as if there is a benefit in doing this, then you find them willing to make commitments to things, right? Because they trust everybody's headed the same direction. They feel as if they actually get a voice in what it is they're doing. They can start making commitments to those things because they were actually invested in those things. And once you've committed to something, it's way easier to hold yourself accountable to it, right? And it's also easier to hold the people around you accountable to it. And then at the end of the day, once you have teams that trust each other and trust the process and trust the direction, and they feel as if they are creating good solutions, even if it's not their solution, and they feel like they can make commitments and they can commit to those commitments, that was redundant, sorry, and they feel like they're able to be accountable to that, then you actually start them looking at how does this make everybody successful. So it's not isolated anymore. It's not just how do I make this individual team successful, it's how do I make this team successful in this ecosystem so that we're all successful. Understand that all hierarchies are incredibly fragile. We do not exist at the top for like more than a second. Usually it's like, well, it's good while we were there, fellas. You know, most of the time, just because this is the way human beings work, we go back and forth. You know, something will come through and completely disrupt the trust that we have in like the direction we're going. Or we'll get an absolute jerk face in a meeting who completely takes it over and we no longer feel as if we have a voice. And now trust is broken, right? So there are lots of things inside of our world. We have a manager who comes through and says, you know, you guys seem to jerk around a lot. Do you ever deliver anything? Despite the fact that you're working your butts off and delivering a lot. Usually it's not your direct manager. Usually it's like some other manager who wandered in and just really wanted to have a voice in things. So understand that hierarchies are fragile. The second thing we should also talk about is the fact that teams, by their nature, ask us to adapt and change, right? There's no such thing as interacting with another person that doesn't force us to have to adapt and change the way we talk, the way we interact, and if you don't, that's when you get yelled at a lot, especially if you have a significant other. So it's really important to understand that teams constantly ask us to adapt and change. And I gave you all of this information so that I can get to the next slide, which I think is one of the best representations of behavioral change that I have seen. This is actually applied to organizational change, like the process we go through when we have to make a change inside of an organization. But this is the change process that happens regardless of the change, regardless of the size of the change, regardless of the kind of the change, regardless of if it is a positive change or a negative change. This is what we go through. Now, how long we stay in any one step and how long it takes us to get from beginning to end varies depending on who we are and the change that we're being asked to do and the way in which that change is handled. So how many of you have been asked to make a big organizational change? How many of you have been told you're going to Agile? How many of you thought that was an amazing freaking idea as soon as they said it? How many of you have done Agile in other places and you were just glad they finally got to it? Right? That's the popular one, and that's actually kind of my wheelhouse. I do a lot of organizational change around movements from less linear methodologies into asynchronous methodologies, which Agile is one of them. But what really happens is that very first moment in time when you're told you're going to change, you actually disrupt the pattern of someone's world, right? that structure, that sound structure that we've come to rely on in order to understand how we function, we've disrupted it. And there is a moment in time where your brain just sort of stops, right? It's that, okay? And this is actually the primordial part of your brain trying to assess if this change is going to harm you, if this is something that you can deal with, if this is something that's going to be okay for you. This is also part of the process where a lot of people be like, yeah, nope, I'm not changing, you can't make me. Now, what you'll realize is as we go through the process, you get from that place of loss where you're actually doing an assessment to a place of doubt. This is where really good companies start inundating people with an insane amount of information about what it means to make the change they've asked you to make. Because the one thing that is true about human beings is if we aren't given information, we are more than happy to make it up. We will fill in the gaps with our own version of reality, right? And I like my version way better than their version, which is why I always adopt it. But this is the thing that says, I want you to make a change, and your response is not, hey, I really want to get a lot of information about this so I understand what's happening to me. Most people's responses are, why? Why do we need to do this? There was nothing wrong with the way we were doing things before. I don't understand why you want me to change. I don't understand why we have to do this thing. I don't understand why you hate me. It's not personal, but I don't understand why you hate me. And then you start rationalizing. Well, here's 5 reasons why we shouldn't change. Do any of you have children? Is this like a bedtime negotiation every night? Like bedtime is a change every night? Yeah. So we'll go through this process and we'll go back and forth, and then we realize at a certain point in time that we don't really have a choice about the change, right? Especially in an organization. We don't have a choice. And we have a lot of anxiety about that. And that anxiety actually causes us to kind of stop. We don't understand how we need to move forward. Even though we've been given a lot of information, our brain hasn't had time to actually process through it and make it an actionable thing. We don't really understand how to get stuff done. We really don't understand the new rules. And we kind of get into this incredibly unproductive state. So out of curiosity, is this familiar to anyone? This sort of like place that you get to where you're like, I don't even know what it is you want me to do. Yeah, I could tell by the chuckling in the room that maybe one person has had this experience. So the other side of discomfort is discovery, and that's the place where you're like, okay, yeah, I don't get it, but maybe I'm willing to try and figure it out. What I want to know is what happens when you can't process through doubt and discomfort? What happens when you can never get to a place where you feel like it's okay for you to be able to try and figure something out? It's too different, it's too threatening, it's too ambiguous, it's too all of those words. What happens? So you kind of need to know this to understand the rest of this conversation. Who recognizes this? Yeah, my brother Maslow. So Maslow says, much like teams have a hierarchy of need, individuals have a hierarchy of need. We are not going to go through all of this. I'm only going to cover the bottom 2 because this is really where that fight between human individual need and organizationally pushed behavioral changes come into conflict. At the very bottom is physiological needs. So that's I have food, I have water, I have shelter, I have warmth. Those are really basic human needs. And so we're going to kind of assume those have been met. The next level up is safety. And this is every kind of safety you can think of. This is financial safety, this is physical safety, this is psychological safety. This is the place where you need to feel as if you're not threatened in order to be able to move into building relationships. And anytime we introduce change, what are we doing? We are driving people way down this hierarchy into a place where they don't feel safe anymore. They used to understand, that made them feel safe. They don't understand now, and that makes them not feel safe. And so that means that instead of being able to use a really nice loop like this where we get to the end and everybody sings and dances and we have parties and apparently we do sumo suits in the foyer, you end up in this, which is a dysfunction loop. Does anybody have any questions thus far? It's all been pretty straightforward, right? People are kind of like complicated things and we put them into complicated situations and they have complicated reactions. So I think there's 3 things I want to kind of call attention to. One is if we can't move forward as human beings, if we don't understand what it means to move forward in a change, we will default back to the last place we felt safe. Because you have to understand, from an individual's perspective, safety is my priority. Your agenda is not. And so I will do things that are irrational in order to provide myself with the space I need in order to feel safe. Right? So this is Mary, who's the nicest person on the entire freaking planet, who has never, ever, ever said anything mean about anybody, being told that she has to make a change, and you saying, "Hi, Mary," and her telling you, "Fuck off." And you're going, "Oh, dear goodness." Sorry. Right? And part of that reaction is she is making you step back and give her space. She's in a place where she can't process. She's in a place where she doesn't understand what the new rules are. And she's going to act in a confrontational way, because most of the time confrontation makes people back up off of us. Think about Grumpy Guy. Anybody work with Grumpy Guy? The one that when you walk up to ask a question, acts as if the world has flipping ended to have to interact with you. He pulls off his headphones, he throws them on the desk, he turns dramatically and he says, "What?" Understand that this is probably his way of saying, I don't do really well with distractions. This is not okay for me. And I begin to act in a dysfunctional way because I get the results I want, right? People stop talking to me, I get the reputation as grumpy guy, they kind of work around me, they don't interrupt me anymore, so I got what I wanted, right? I got the space I needed to feel as if I'm safe and productive, and I don't have to deal with people I think are stupid and irrelevant. But once it's become learned, it becomes the default go-to reaction, right? Grumpy guy no longer has kind of a variance in his behavior. That has become his normal. And what happens when his normal no longer works? He escalates. How many of you ever met people who de-escalated anything, ever? Like, our normal reaction is always escalate. So no longer is he grumpy guy, now he's abusive guy. I mean, now you walk over and he's like, "Why can't you figure this out on your own? I mean, are you stupid? Are we not hiring stupid people? You can't go to the Confluence site and figure this out. You can't go to Google and figure this out. It's what everybody's doing." Dang, no longer talking to grumpy guy. Grumpy guy is now hostile guy. But it's because his old methods didn't work. People got used to him, they started ignoring them, and because he still needs personal space in order to feel safe in doing his job, he's going to create that space. And this is what I believe a lot of people don't realize, is that teams are kind of constantly pushing us to that edge of interaction where we're having to gauge exactly how safe we are in those environments. That happens in a lot of different ways, right? And it can happen momentarily and then it's fine again. That's that hierarchy, right? We can get to a place where we're like, maybe not, okay, yes, I'm fine. But this is what I think happens, is we put people in positions where they just don't know how to get out of that loop of, I need something I can't explain, I'm going to behave in a way that gives me the thing I need, and then I'm just going to keep doing it because it was really useful. And this is where I think we fail people, because we promote people and never, ever, 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 ever talk to them about how to deal with people. We just assume, like, I don't know, you're born with a handbook. When you become a manager, they give you the magic little cue cards that say, these are all the things you need to do in order to make your team not hate you. They didn't give me one of those. My teams will tell you they did not give me one of those. So this is actually an interesting pattern for changing behavior. And I would be interested to know if anybody can recognize the model. So this says, I'm in a place where I don't believe I need to change, right? The very first step is I don't even know I need to change. I have no idea that my behavior is causing issue, or I may be kind of aware with it, but I don't necessarily think it is a big deal. I don't think it is an issue. And then I get to that place where I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe it is an issue. Maybe I do have something I need to deal with. This is also the place where we can go back to, nah, it's not an issue, no worries. But eventually we'll get to the place where we're like, you know what? Yeah, I really think maybe this is something I need to do, so what do I do? Right? And you put together a plan, and then you start trying to execute against that plan, and eventually over time, it becomes a behavior change. Something else that should be understood about behavior changes, what happens when you're put under stress? You revert back. Here's the example I give. I don't need to exercise. I don't need to. There's nothing wrong. Well, crap, I got those labs back from the doctor that suggest perhaps I am not my own doctor. Maybe I do need to exercise. Nah, screw it, I'm not going to exercise. I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. So I just spent Saturday with my kids playing soccer where I sat down and they brought me the ball and I rolled it to them. Maybe I need to consider this exercise thing. I know, I'm going to run a marathon. That's what I'm going to do. I've done nothing physical since I was 16 years old and I am going to run 26 miles. So like 2 miles in, I get a strain and I'm like, that was stupid. Why did I want to exercise? And I stop. Right? Because I didn't have any sort of realistic plan about how I was going to execute on this kind of goal. So I go back to, yeah, not me, and eventually I'm like, yeah, okay, so I have to. And then I get back to the place where I'm planning the plan, and if I'm smart, I don't default to marathon, because that did not work the last time. I think, my Y does classes once a week, why don't I join one of the classes and try and go once a week? And so I start going once a week, and I really kind of like it. And they have another class, so now I'm going twice a week, and I'm really enjoying it, and all of a sudden it becomes a behavior. Now instead of somebody calling up and saying, hey, we're going to go out and drink lots of alcohol, do you want to come? I say, yeah, but I have to run first, instead of, yeah, sure, I'm going to skip the running. So that would be the difference in my world. I actually think you should be able to run on a treadmill with a beer. That seems like it's an efficiency gain. So I say this because this is pretty much the pattern that most people have to go through in order to establish a behavioral change. They have to identify that it needs to happen. It has to be a realistic plan that they actually can execute on. And this is where support and environment and motivation and all of that stuff comes into play, right? Realistically speaking, if you make a decision to make a change completely in isolation, you're probably not going to make it. Anybody tried to diet in a household where everybody else ate crap? How hard was that? How often did you fail? Anybody ever tried to diet where the whole household just kind of ate healthier? How easy was that? Not saying it wasn't challenging, not saying that you aren't going to fail, but how much easier was that, right? You created an environment where you were much more likely to succeed. And I think this is the thing that we underestimate when we ask teams to make changes, is we can't just ask them to make changes, we also have to support them in those changes. We have to help provide environments, we have to help provide safeguards, we have to help provide words that they can use to say, hey, I think maybe I'm failing here, without ever having to say emotional things like, hey, I think I'm failing here. Because I have never met a developer who has failed at anything. You laugh, but it's true. I have found that in a one-on-one conversation, this model works really well. So most people will say things like, stop being annoying. That was amazing, because I have no idea what you're talking about. Right? How many of you have told your children, stop being noisy? How many of your children have looked at you and said, we're not? So I found that if you're going to talk about somebody's behavioral issue, you really need to give them very specific examples. Give them facts, give them something that they can latch onto and identify with, so they understand that the behavior you're asking them not to engage in is not nebulous. It's actually, in fact, something very specific. Give them very clear direction about what you would like to have the end result be, and then ask them how you help them. Right? So this can be team member to team member, this can be leadership to team member, this can be leadership to leadership, but this is actually a really effective way to have conversations in general. So this is, hey, Bob, you click your pen in meetings, like when you're really thinking about something, and oh my gosh, it is so distracting to me. And I get that you're just thinking, right? This is sort of your way of thinking, but can we get you a fidget spinner? Can we get you, something that's just not as noisy so that you can still do what you need to do and I'm not distracted by this? I mean, so this is all of those components, right? It's very specific about the thing. I asked them to change their behavior and gave them some examples, and then I offered to help them. Dude, I will buy the fidget spinner for you. Anything we need to get you there. It just, this isn't working for me. This is really distracting. How do we not do that anymore? And these are really big conversations too, but obviously the bigger the conversation, the harder this thing is to do. I had a team lead that the team actually really liked and very much respected. But when he got excited in a design session, his was the only voice. And he would just talk over people, and if you had another idea, he would argue you into the ground about why his idea was better. At a certain point in time, I think that people just walked in with white flags, like, we surrender, just tell us what you need us to do, And they liked this guy. But it was really becoming obvious that it was demoralizing to the team. They had kind of stopped interacting. They were just like, yeah, tell us what it is you want us to execute on, we'll just go and do it. And so I pulled him aside and said, hey, dude, I value your insight and opinion. I think you're an amazing contributor to this team. It's obvious the guys respect you. But in this particular environment, when you get really excited and you start talking about people and you start showing that kind of passion in a way that makes other people feel as if their voices can't be heard, you're shutting down all those opportunities for really good ideas to happen. So what I'd like you to do is be the last person to speak. We still want your ideas. You're hugely valuable to us. You've been here a long time. You have a lot of understanding of the world, but just be the last person to speak. And I would like to go ahead and share this with the team so that they know that you recognize the fact that their ideas are important too. Is that cool with you? He says, yeah, that's completely cool. He's like, I didn't even know I was doing it. I had no idea that my team felt that way. So this is where we get to go in and apply it to a team. It's the same conversation, but different. It's the same but different. That's helpful, right? When you're going to go and talk to a team, the one piece of advice I will give you that is infinitely important, make sure the team understands that you're talking about behaviors, not people. Because conversations about changing behavior are really uncomfortable for people, especially if you're going to have them in a group. And it's really important at the very beginning of that to set the rules about, we can talk about any behavior we think we need to address, but we're not going to talk about people. Because it's not the person we want to change per se. There are a few I'd love to change. It's really the behavior that we want to talk about. So I had a team that actually had gotten in a very contentious them and us scenario where they had stopped delivering at all because it was always about them and them. And so when we actually sat down to have a conversation about the fact that the behavior wasn't going to fly with the team, this was one of the rules we set, was you can talk about any behavior you want, but you can't talk about anybody. And you also have to use your own voice, which is the next bullet, right? The only person you get to talk about is you. You don't get to speak for anybody else. So when you decide you're going to address a behavior, everybody needs to define what that end goal looks like. And you have to be very clear that you're using words in the same way. So when I first started this, every new team I got, I asked them why they were there. You know, what was their goal, what was their purpose? And I had a team that 100% hands down, stacked, kumbaya moment, agreed. We are here to deliver value. Cool, huh? It's amazing. We're all here to deliver value. So 2 weeks later, we get in the room, and the quality engineer on my team stands up and looks at one of my devs and says, what the hell is wrong with you? You have spent all week refactoring code, not talking to a damn person, breaking every test on this team. How can we deliver value if you keep being a dumbass? And the dev says, what the hell are you talking about? Refactoring that code was my contribution to value. It's more streamlined, it makes more sense, it's adhering to standards a lot better. I did deliver value. You're the one who's not delivering value. And I'm standing there, you know, as the Scrum Master going, none of you fuckers delivered anything. How are we doing value at all? See where that problem was? It's really important that we are using words in the same way, which is why when we use ambiguous words like value, quality, speed to delivery, we probably should decide what that means. And we should say it out loud, and we should get agreement around what definition of those words are, because it's really hard to be on the same page when you're not even speaking the same language. So the next thing you need to do, once you've said, this is a behavior we want to change, so in this instance, it was my architect deciding the behavior he wanted to change was talking over people. The team said, hey man, we really appreciate you doing this experiment, you know, that shows us that you actually do care about us. And then we said, well, how do we make sure that this is within, or how do we make sure that we're letting you know when you're deviating from the agreed upon behavior change? So they decided they would just raise their hands. No confrontation, no calling people out. They were just going to raise their hands and say, all right, dude, you know, you need to wait your turn. And it became this amazing game after a while, because the first couple of times, without thinking, he would start in and the whole team would. And they would just wait, and he'd be like, gosh, I'm sorry, you guys, I'm sorry. I just want to make this one point. And they'd raise their hand again. And he's like, you know, so he'd sit down and you see him like, just notes. He was writing a small lecture. You know, and over time, what happened was they raised their hands less, and he listened more because he wasn't thinking about what it was he needed to say. He wasn't thinking about how to structure the argument to win people over. He wasn't thinking about just moving forward. He was actually starting to listen to the people talk in the room. And so kind of the unintended cool thing that happened was we had a lot more really neat ideas come out because they weren't just his ideas. And he got really excited about those. And he was able to support his team in a completely different kind of way because he talked last. And I'm lucky he was a really good guy, right? He was okay to take a little bit of hazing. There wasn't a whole lot of ego wrapped up in this where he slammed his crap down and walked out of the room because everybody raised their hand. Let's see. And any lack of sincerity has to be dealt with quickly. And this is really, really hard. This is the guy who nods along but then does his own crap anyway. And I'm using guy generically. Sorry. This is the person. This is the person that nods along and then does their own thing anyway. They seem like they're committed, they seem like they're on board, they've done all the oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, but as soon as they are out of the room, they just kind of do their own thing. And if you don't deal with that, I guarantee you, you will demoralize your team and you will see dysfunction enter back into your team. Right? You'll start seeing those behaviors where people are like, well, how come he gets to do that thing if we all agreed to do this thing? I don't understand. Or, you know what? We don't want to work with him anymore if he's not going to be a team player, which, by the way, is amazing kindergarten behavior I see all the time. We're going to take our toys and move over here and play with each other, and he has to stay over there and play with his toys because we don't want to play with him. And so addressing those things pretty early on, either as a concerned team member or as somebody who is a leader on this team, and I'm talking role of leader as opposed to behavior of leader because you all should be behaving as leaders, is to kind of pull dude aside and say, man, what's going on? You seemed like you were committed, you said you were committed, but then you went and did this thing over here. What happened? I mean, what are we missing? What are you thinking that we're not getting? How do we help you feel like it's okay for you to move to this other side? Notice I just structured that conversation exactly like the last slide with all the crazy little bullets. I really do use this a lot. If you're going to have conversations about behavior, please define with your team what bad is actually, like what it actually means to be bad, what a bad behavior is. Because what you'll find is you will put your personal bias on somebody else. Well, I think it's really bad, when you're not 5 minutes early for a meeting. Okay, cool, thank you for sharing. So these are the ones that I actually use. I think that a behavior at a team is worth talking about if it keeps you from being able to deliver value. If what's going on is stopping the team from being able to move forward, and by the way, I'm meaning delivery of value in that we're actually able to get stuff in front of the users that are intended to consume it so that they can enjoy the cool things that we do, right? If we're doing things that are preventing us from being able to move in that direction, we have to talk about that. If we are doing things that are going to undermine the unity of the team, we should talk about that. So that's that them and us scenario, right? This is where you end up with factions on your team, where you have one person who strongly believes and people will gravitate towards them, and you have another person who strongly believes and people will gravitate towards them, and you can never kind of get them to talk about what's going to actually work in reality as opposed to in their head. And then there's if the behavior is inadvertently affecting one or a couple of members in the team, right? So this is, the team thinks it's really funny to decorate John's cube with Cleveland Browns crap when the Cleveland Browns lose, so John's cube is constantly decorated Cleveland Brown crap. John does not find this freaking funny. As a matter of fact, he thinks it's insulting. Once was a joke, every time he's done with it. It's stupid, right? It's just a little thing we're doing. It's a team, camaraderie thing, but John doesn't freaking think it's funny, so just stop it. Don't alienate John over something ridiculous or even something more serious. That was an easy example. We did this to somebody. They really did not like it. So I will tell you that this is probably the best thing you can do for your team is make sure you're all on the same page about when we need to actually intersect and deal with a behavior. If you are in a role of leadership, don't get in the sandbox and fight your kids' wars. For the most part, teams will have moments of contention, and then they'll kind of work through them, and then they'll get in a place where they're working really well, and then something will happen, and they'll be in a point of contention, and then they'll work through it, things are working really well. You can coach, you can offer advice, but don't get in the sandbox and fight your kids' fights. Just let them figure it out on their own. The time you need to be stepping in as a leader is when one of these three things is going to become true. When what they're engaging in, that they don't seem to be able to figure out how to resolve themselves, is going to cause one of these things to be true. And then it's your freaking job to step in and say, time out, let's just talk through this. We can't keep going this way. How do we change this? And that's where some of those frameworks for conversations come in play. All right, I'm going to stop here. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Is anybody finding this useful, or are you all asleep? Are you all asleep? Oh no, that guy's not. Hi! So I think it's important to add a couple of caveats, because what I did was really broad stroke generalize a lot of topics. Sometimes people are not able to make the changes we need them to make. They just can't. And it's not because they're bad people, and it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they're not able to. And we do them a disservice by leaving them in that position because they will never succeed there. And by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean firing somebody. This should just be team dynamic, right? This person is on a team that they're never going to gel with, they're never going to be able to figure out how to work with, and keep telling them play nicer with people is not going to help. They just can't. It's not inside of their makeup to be able to deal in that kind of a team, and you just are jacking them around by leaving them there, and you're screwing with that team by leaving them there. And this doesn't mean, like, you know, the first time you get into like a place where, oh, well, we've had a fight, you give up, right? We've really tried, and it's really obvious. There's just no synergy here. This is not going to work. We're not going to be able to figure out a way to be productive and have that person or persons be part of our world. It is your job to that person in that position to move them to a place they're going to be successful. Do not leave them there to fail. Obviously, this is a big passion point for me. Do not leave your people in positions they are going to fail. It's just the most screwed up thing we do as organizations. It just truly is. Find them a different team, find them a different role, or let them go so that they can find somewhere else that's not making them miserable. If you can't break the cultural change, you won't be able to do this. So understand that dealing with dysfunction is introducing conflict into an environment. You can't deal with dysfunction and not confront dysfunction, right? We can't just hint at it. We can't just sort of passively, aggressively, try and deal with it. If you are in a culture that is conflict adverse and you are unable or unwilling to deal with the dysfunction, it's not going to change. And this is also a place where we should stop and talk about if the culture is what is introducing the dysfunction, you are in an uphill fight. Here's the easiest example. Companies go agile all the time. How many of you are on a compensation structure that's about the quality of your team, how well your team is doing? I see no hands. How many of you are on a compensation structure that's based on your individual contribution and your individual performance plans? So remind me again how that's going to help us create team cultures. I'm not saying that people are going to just be jerks. I'm saying a company is incentivizing me to freaking care about me, to make sure that I'm doing the things I need to do to check off the box, even if it maybe makes my team a little less functional, or I'm not as attentive to my team, or I'm not focused on delivery and building into my team. I'm being incentivized not to. I always found this to be the strangest thing, that it's not even taken into consideration how well your team is doing in your performance if I've told you you're going to be part of a collaborative team culture. So just kind of understand it's not impossible, it's just ridiculously hard if the world outside your team is influencing your team to behave a certain way, or is rewarding them for behaving in a certain way. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and this is kind of the point about leadership as a behavior, not as a role, leadership matters. And this is one of those things where when you go in and introduce new ideas to a team, or you ask a team to behave differently, watch who the team looks to see if they can, right? Human groups, by their nature, will have somebody that has been identified as leader, even if it's not their role. Somebody they trust, somebody that they look to, somebody that they respect, somebody who they feel is going to give them good guidance. And if that person is opposed to that change is not going to happen on that team. And if you can't get that leader behind you to help support you and help move in that direction, the chances of you making that team even acknowledge the fact that there is a problem they should address is like this. It's zero. Can you see it? Zero. Zero. Because the absolute truth is, if your team doesn't agree there is a problem, there is no problem in their world. You thinking it's a problem is not the same as them agreeing it's a problem, right? Being 5 minutes late for stand-up. It's a problem in my world. I need you there. It's a commitment, right? It's a show of respect. It's a show of dedication. If my team's like, meh, and they're all that way, and the leader says, meh, what are my chances of being able to convince them that it's really kind of important that they show up on time for stand-up? maybe the one guy who's scared of me? That would be it. Right, so leadership matters. So does anybody have anything they would like to share as far as ahas or takeaways or questions? And this is a giant, giant room, so you're going to have to speak like it's a giant, giant room and ignore the blinding light.
Question.
Yeah.
So, distracted meeting.
Yes.
Phones, computers. Have you been able to crack the nut on that to get people to be more present?
Huh. Hey, is anybody here from one of my teams?
Yes.
Have I been able to crack the nut on that?
Yes.
The answer to that is you just don't bring them.
Right on.
I have had meetings where I have asked VPs to leave the room if they needed to be on their phone because it was obvious they had something else they needed to take care of, and I didn't want them to feel obligated to be somewhere when they needed to be somewhere else. Because I honestly believe it is a sign of respect to shut your computer screen and interact with the human beings in the room. It also means if you're facilitating that meeting, it is your responsibility to make sure it is an effective and efficient meeting. Right? It's a trade-off. I say don't bring your laptops unless you're on support, and that's a different ball of wax. Don't bring your cell phones, and in return, I will make sure that we stay on point in this meeting. And if we start drifting off and it starts becoming non-relevant, I'll just let you go. Is that helpful? Yeah. Anybody else? I can't see you people, just talk.
What about managing up?
Managing up? Managing up is the most fun part of any job you'll ever have. It really, truly is. I actually find that it kind of depends on the personality of the person you're managing up to as the techniques you want to do. But for the most part, most managers, and again, I'm broad stroke generalizing, want to help. They want to be useful, they want to be of value, and they don't really have any idea how to do it, and so they're going to do it in the only way they understand how to do it, and a lot of times that is disruptive. If you're talking about how do you get people on board who think they know everything, it's a little bit trickier, right? We have business partners that love to tell us how to do our job, and I love those conversations. They're amazing. I just watch my devs fall asleep on the table. My business partner's like, why don't they ever listen? And I was like, I'm fairly sure because you don't even speak their language. In seriousness, no, managing up is difficult, and it's something that you may have to get partnership to do. I have allied myself with other people that they respected, that I had good relationships with. That has helped. I have had repetitive conversations where I say, hey, this is the behavior I need out of you. How do I help support you to get you there? I have had conversations with people who told me to butt out. It was none of my business. They would manage any way they wanted to manage. So I think that it's kind of a human technique, right? Because you have to understand they're in the exact same boat we are. They're managing against safety and esteem, right? They want to feel safe. They want to feel heard. They want to feel as if they're important. And if we're doing things that make them feel not heard, not important, then we're sort of managing in the opposite end of their hierarchy of needs. So a lot of this is just about understanding how you get to the place where you help people feel safe enough to kind of be useful. I know, it's a chump answer, but it's a good one. There were hands in this general area. Hang on. Hang on. You, guy in the corner who's raised his hand like 9 times now.
I was wondering, you said, talk about keeping meetings on point and focus, that way where they don't feel like you're wasting your time. How do you help other teams or people that might invite you to those meetings that aren't keeping them, in your interest, so you feel like you're wasting time? How do you talk to possibly different teams to make sure they do that for you?
If you want my personal answer, I stopped going to their meetings. By the way, that's with risk. I'm not recommending the room do that. But I'll just stop going to the meeting, and then I'm more than happy to go to that person who's facilitating that meeting and be like, dude, I would love to come and contribute, but I don't understand how I can. I don't understand what my value is going to be in this meeting if we're always talking about this stuff. So is there something that I can do that would help, that meeting kind of stay on point so that we can talk about these things? Or is it just cool that I stop going and you let me know if you need something from me and we talk about it then? Honesty really does work as long as you're sincere and not jerky. I used to block my calendar on Fridays and not go to any meetings. I would just decline them because honestly, if you were pulling me in on a meeting on Friday, that shit I could do till Monday anyway. Why did it matter? And I would go to other people's meetings. I think the guy in the corner can tell you, I may have done it to him. I would just walk through and I would ask somebody how they're doing, and they would be like, I have to go. And I'd be like, where are you going? They're like, I have to go to a meeting. And I'd be like, I want to go to that meeting too. And I did. And it confused the heck fire out of the person running the meeting as to why I showed up and smiled and sat in the corner. But I learned more about my organization going to the meetings I wasn't invited to than I ever did about the meetings I was invited to. And it was amazing how many times I could raise my hand and be like, hey, have you guys talked to these people about it? Because this feels really similar to a conversation I just had about this topic. So that was another way that I was deviating from a social norm, but I wasn't necessarily acting in a dysfunction. So somebody in the middle who I was rude to? Oh, that's a whole other topic. We'll do that in the next Star Trek. I'll make slides for it and everything. The short answer is, if you think dealing with a team is complicated, try making a cultural change. How many of you have ever tried to integrate a really complex system with a really complex system? How many of you thought it was really, really easy and fun and you want to sign up for it every day? You're masochists, I don't want to talk to you. That's what cultural change is, right? It's having really complex systems and really complex systems trying to figure out how to interact with each other and then asking those systems to change how they fundamentally want to react. Remember that one of the things we talked about is if I don't know how to move forward, I'm always going to default back to the last place where I felt like I understood what was going on. Cultures kind of behave in the same way. I think what is harder is when you get to a place that doesn't even understand what its culture is, right? And that happens a lot in change. Is you disrupt an understood culture and you don't necessarily define a new culture, and people keep trying to fit the new methodology and way of thinking in the old culture. But yeah, honestly, if you want to talk about that these people are not going to want that conversation. It's really long. But I do like the question. Do come find me. Hand in the corner. You could just threaten their life. That seems to work pretty well. I like to start with, I'm going to beat you blind if you don't help. I honestly think that most people are incredibly well-intentioned, and they don't understand what it is that somebody's big beef with them is. I think having an honest conversation, if this is somebody that you can have an honest conversation with, have an honest conversation with them about, when I say this thing, this is what I mean, but you seem to be doing this, and I need us to figure out how we bridge the divide between what I need and where you are, right? A lot of this is just talking to people and understanding that it's not going to be easy, right? When you're asking somebody to make a behavior change, you're basically saying, I'm also willing to change my behaviors to help you get there. So it's kind of this like symbiotic thing that you do. You can't refuse to change and assume everybody's going to just do it because you said so. But I do find that, hands down, the best way to do these things is just to talk to people. Be honest with them, be sincere, don't be a douchebag. I mean, all of these things will help kind of garner those conversations, and do understand and respect the fact that sometimes people are just going to shut you down. They are not in a place where they can have that conversation with you. So give them some space, give them some time, and try having it again. Anybody else?
How did you resolve that conflict you talked about at the beginning?
The police. To be fair, I didn't do anything. This was one of the greatest learning experiences I was ever in the number of bad, terrible, horrible failures I had in trying to resolve something that was really difficult to resolve. So I spent a lot of time learning about what you don't do in situations where you have a lot of extreme dysfunction. At the end of the day, they fired the team lead, they moved the architect, they promoted one of the guys that actually was a leader inside of the team up. The team kind of leveled out because a couple of guys just sort of left. I mean, it sort of happened in a pattern over a long period of time. They got to a place where they were able to do what they needed to do, but it was, I cannot even begin to tell you the number of mistakes I made trying to help them along the way, and the things that I learned from it, and the value I got from it, as far as, you can't tell people to change. You can't just walk in and say, you suck, become a less sucky person. Doesn't work that way. Anybody else? Because I think I'm about out of time.
How do you make that determination, though, when the decision between when it's how you're approaching the problem carries
they'll let you know. I mean, maybe not verbally, but with their behaviors, right? Because our behaviors speak to our intent. And if somebody is honestly trying to make a change, then I'm going to give them a heck of a lot more runway than if they keep telling me yes and keep doing the same things. This is like the kid that keeps saying they're sorry, but they keep doing it. At the end of the day, I don't care about your sorries, I care about your behavior, so stop telling me you're sorry and start doing something about it. And I think it's a judgment call about that person and that environment and that situation. And I think it's also understanding that change is really hard. It's really hard. It's really hard for me. It's going to be really hard for them. And so sometimes they're going to kind of make some forward momentum, and then they're going to fall back. And how do you create environments so they feel supported? How do you create environments so that they feel that they can talk about the challenges that they're having? How do you create environments so that people feel as if they're not going to be talked down to or made fun of or belittled when they come to you and say, dude, I don't think I can do this. So that's some of it. Did that help?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Sometimes it's good to be helpful. Anybody else?
Do you find team size is correlated to dysfunction?
No? I do think it's harder to deal with dysfunction when you add more people. I've had an incredibly dysfunctional 3-man team because they were special. No, I think anytime you have a social interaction between, so let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a dysfunctional place with your spouse? How big is that team? I do think dealing with dysfunction is harder when you add more people, right? Because now I'm having to deal with the complexity of more than just me and another single entity. Now I'm doing the complexity of me, another single entity, another single entity, another single entity. And when you spread that out at a certain point in time, trying to get people on the same page and marching in the same direction becomes almost impossible, which is why we say breakdown in communication, really good communication happens at about 7-ish people. Because at that point in time, you really have 2 groups of people kind of existing in the same space. Anything else?
Are these conversations independently or as teams, like intervention?
I think it depends on your team and the conversation. Some conversations that we've had no issues having like as a group of people, and some conversations out of respect for that person, I had with them first. Especially if it was a conversation where like it was kind of a, hey, I'm going to call you out on something. There have been a couple of people here who have done things that I wanted to use as examples of behaviors that the team didn't want to engage in, that they just happened to be the person that perpetrated. And I've come to them, beforehand and say, hey, look, I'd really like to use this as an example of something that we can learn from and grow from. I don't want you to feel called out. I don't want you to feel as if I'm attacking you. Is it cool if I use this as an example? And they've said, yeah. I've also had people that be like, I really, really don't. Can we not? I was like, okay, but if the team brings it up, we need to talk about it. And I think it depends, right? Those conversations that probably are going to go dramatically wrong if you bring it up in front of a group of people versus those conversations that make sense. But at the end of the day, if you're a part of a team, that trust on the bottom of it is also saying, hey, you guys, I realize I've kind of been doing this thing and I want to get better at it. Or as a group of people, you can say, hey, you know what? As a group of people, we've really been slacking on the quality of the code we've been pushing through to our quality engineers. We see the defects going up. We see the items coming back getting higher. We've really gotten lazy with just our basic engineering. And as a group of people, we want to change that because it's not cool and QA are really mean and we don't want them mad at us. Right, so the team itself will kind of self-regulate sometimes. And you may have to be the one that says, so we've gone from 2 bugs to 200 bugs. Are we just in love with bugs now? Are we now coding for failure? I mean, what has happened that you didn't tell me about? So some of it is just dynamics of the conversation. All right, I got time for like maybe one more. Hand. Oh my gosh, tiny voice, I did not hear you. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So there is an etiquette for remote that you just have to adhere to and agree to adhere to as a team. If you have people who are not in the room with you, you have to be more formal in your interactions. It's a courtesy, it's a respect thing. It has nothing to do with trying to make people not creative. But if I can't see you, I don't know that you're going to get ready to talk, right? And it's also just being cognizant of the fact that it is a more formal kind of communication. You do have to say, hey, does anybody on the phone have something they need? I'm going to ask people in the room just to pause for a second so I can check in with those guys. If you hear somebody talking on the phone, just say, hey, wait a second, room. It sounds like, the X person on the phone has something they need to say. What's up with that person? It's just more formal communication. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.